Okay, guys, so welcome to Web Dev. Today is October 20th, and today we'll be talking about CSS Flexbox. So this will help you with spacing and other things. So just a basic agenda, we'll do Flexbox, and we found sort of a Flexbox activity. We'll give you a few minutes to try it, and ultimately you can try it more on your own if you're interested in it. And we'll talk a little bit about CSS Grid and some animations, and then we'll end it off with a demo. Whoops.
All right, so let's start by defining what Flexbox is in the first place. So Flexbox is a functionality that is built into CSS, and it essentially allows you to make your page responsive to different screen sizes and different devices. In other words, it makes elements responsive to one another. So for example, if you use Flexbox, you can make sure that your site looks pretty on both an iPhone and a laptop. So before we dive in too deep about Flexbox, let's talk about the concept of parent and child. If you've coded in languages such as Java, you may be familiar with this concept. It relates to class hierarchies and class inheritance in that case. However, in the box, this is a little bit different. Parent and child refers to the container as well as the elements that are contained within the container. And this is important as you're going to be looking at different Flexbox properties. But first and foremost, in order to actually use Flexbox, you're going to need to use the display property in CSS, and you're going to need to put the flex value, which is basically going to create your flex container, which is going to be the parent that is going to contain the children, aka the elements within it. And by doing this, you're essentially creating what is called a flex context that allows you to use Flexbox to modify, or not to say modify, but rearrange and organize your container and whatever is inside of it. So there are several containers that you can use, div, I think, being one of the more common ones. But when you're deciding on the container you want to use, just keep in mind there are two main types, block and inline containers. And the main difference between that is a block container is going to take up the entire width that is available to it, whereas inline containers are going to only take up as much space as they actually take up. So if you look on the right, you have we have a class that concerns a div, and there's a red border around it so you can see where it is. And in order to create it, you use the display flex, which is going to create the flex container. And since it's a div, it's going to be a block flex container. And on the bottom, we have a class concerning a span, which we differentiate with a green border, and we do the same thing, but the only difference this time is it creates an inline container. If you look at the bottom, you can see that the block container takes up a lot more space than the text actually does, and it does so without having to say anything about width in the CSS. However, the span only takes up as much as the text takes up. So here's a little bit of a conceptual understanding point for you. You can't put a block tag within an inline tag. However, you can put an inline tag within a block. So in other words, you can have a span within a div, but you can't have a div within a span. All right, now let's talk about what you can actually do with Flexbox. And let's start by talking about justify content and the align content properties. Before we dive in too deep, keep in mind that this is for the parent overall, or in other words, is going to affect everything in the container, not just individual elements within it. So first and foremost, we have justify content. And basically, as you can see in the image, it aligns items on what is called the main axis. I think by default in Flexbox, it's basically to align items based on the horizontal axis. Then we have align items, which has similar values to justify content, but the only difference is that it aligns items on what is called the cross axis. For now, think of it as the vertical axis by default. Then we have what is called align content, and that's a little bit different than align items, because if you have extra space on the cross axis, it gives you new methods to space between and space around. But we can link a website later on that goes more in depth about what the difference is. So then that raises a question: what if you want to move a specific element within a container, but without affecting all the other ones? So for example, if you've already defined what align item is, but there's a specific element that you want to rearrange, you could use the align self property, which is specific to the child of the element. And that's only one of the methods that you can use. There are obviously a lot more, but this is one of the examples. And what it essentially does is it, I guess, overrides what align item says and performs what the align self is on the item itself, the individual item, and not all the items within the container. So now let's go over flex direction and flex wrap. This may be a little bit confusing at first, but flex direction essentially, so in Flexbox by default, if you create a flex container, all your elements are essentially going to be ordered on the same line in a row. And flex direction allows you to control that. It allows you to change the order of the elements. It allows you to turn your row into a column. And it also allows you to combine those two, turning it into a column and switching the order. So the main takeaway from flex direction is that it actually defines what the main axis is. And I'll go more in depth into this in the example to the right. But for now, keep in mind that it can change the axis of the justify and align items. But we'll see that in a little bit. Then there's the flex wrap property. So as I mentioned before, by default, flex containers try to order all the elements onto one line. However, you can use the flex wrap property to sort of dictate how the flex should respond to items that are a little bit squished onto the same line. So for example, if you say no wrap, that's kind of self-explanatory. It's basically saying don't do anything if you run out of space, just bunch everything on the same line. Wrap, on the other hand, it says if you run out of space, just whatever is remaining, put it onto the next line. And wrap reverse does the same thing, but from bottom to top. Wrap does it from top to bottom, wrap reverse from bottom to top. And if you want to combine flex direction and flex wrap, you can do flex flow. It's essentially going to, you're going to write it in the format as direction first and wrap second, and that is that. So let's revisit this idea of changing or redefining the main axis. So as you can see on the right, we have a row of frogs, which are actually, this is part from the game that you'll play in a little bit. But we have a row of frogs, and they're all squished onto the same line. Then, as you can see in the code in the middle, we use the flex flow property, and we say, okay, turn this row of frogs into a column, and whatever doesn't fit onto the line, put it over into the next line. And so this is essentially the result of that first line of written code. Then we do justify content. And if you remember the analogy I made before, justify content supposedly should act on the x-axis. However, since we said that the flex direction is a column now, the main axis upon which the justify content acts has become vertical. So the frogs are going to be centered vertically rather than horizontally. So that's the important takeaway from this slide. So now you can, I'll link the game in the chat. You can spend 5 minutes playing around with the different Flexbox properties. It's pretty self-explanatory, but if you have any questions, we will be happy to answer them.
Yeah, just like let us know if you come across any questions you didn't get, and I can do them, or I can explain them. Okay, so I'll just go through the first few, so maybe you can understand how it works. So here we want, okay, so we want, the container is this entire like blue box, and we want it to appear on the right side of the box. So that means we have to use justify content, because that allows us to edit along the horizontal axis, and then we can just use flex end, which puts it at the very right. And then this one, it's very similar, except you can see that we want it in the center, so we'll do the same thing. And you can just continue. This one is probably space between. Or it could be space around. Okay. Yeah, so space between means that there won't be any space on the left of the green or the right of the red frog. So it has to be space around. This would be, and then this would be space between. And I guess you can continue. Okay, I'll just give it, I'll give you guys a minute or two more, and then we can continue.
So you don't need to know all of them, but you should be familiar that they exist and that when you want to position things nicely on the page, you should use Flexbox. And if you have trouble, just look it up, and there's probably some tutorial from like W3 schools. So make sure that whenever you're styling something, you use the right thing. And in most cases, it's Flexbox.
Okay, so I'm going to continue now. So there's also another concept called CSS Grid. This is similar to Flexbox. However, this allows you to do much more complex layouts where it's a lot like a 2D plane rather than Flexbox, which is a 1D, one-dimensional plane, and you have to manually adjust for the center or the end for both the vertical and horizontal axis. The grid makes this a lot easier, as you can define it a lot like a grid you might see in math, and you can have boxes, and you can have elements that span across multiple grid items, or you can just have them span across one grid item. This is a pretty good video that details 3 ways which you can use CSS Grid. It's not really necessary, but if you want, you can check it out. But most of what you'll be doing won't really use CSS Grid. Okay, and then there's also a few ways we can do animations. One thing is hover animations, which we essentially use a hover selector, which allows us to change CSS properties when the mouse is hovered over. So this is kind of like a much easier way to create animations based on hover, rather than like trying to use JavaScript or anything. There's just a selector. So it's pretty good to be aware of this. And all you need to do is just have your normal tag name or your whatever selector query you've used, and just have hover on the element that would be hovered over. And so in this example, you can see that there's a link, and all that happens is that when the link is hovered over, it'll be underlined. Okay, and then there's also CSS animations. These are time-based animations rather than based on the status of an element. So with this, you can add things like animation delays, you can add duration and even repetition. You can make your own, and however, it's much easier just to use a library that's already defined. So this is one library which is super simple to use. They have a lot of different animations here already, and if you want, you can just kind of take a look through it. But if we have time, I'll probably also show you how to use it. It's pretty simple to set up. Okay, and then now I'm gonna go through a demo that we'll be doing. Okay, so just like open a REPL and we will get started. I'll give you guys a few minutes to open REPL. Make sure to select HTML, CSS, JavaScript.
You're muted.
Damn it. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so rather than sort of just going through with Flexbox, I felt that it would be easier if we have some sort of goal in sight. So we're going to try to, our goal is to try to make sort of a replica of this page, or try to get this same type of design. So just to start out, when we're looking at this, we see that there's two columns. There's one column here as well as one column here. So that's probably a good place where we can start with the Flexbox, just create two columns. And so the way we can do this is we have one div which will have a class for, I'll call it like text probably. And this will be the left side column. And then we'll have another div and we'll put a class of like socials. Okay, so on the left-hand side, we'd probably just want like a H1 tag and maybe an H3 tag. So we can just get the HTML out of the way. Okay, and then you see this arrow, you may not be sure how to make those arrows. You can kind of just search up HTML code arrow and should come up. Yeah, so we want to use the right arrow, which would just be and RARR. Okay, so when we run this, okay, so we have this text here, and now we'll also make these socials, which it seems like making these socials, it might just be easiest to make it in an unordered list. So let's do that. And we'll just type some values here. Honestly, we can just use the same thing for all of them. Okay, and let's just check. Yep, so we have this setup, and maybe we'll put a section around the whole thing, and this will allow us to have a parent element. And I'm just going to put an ID as intro. So the reason I'm putting a section around everything is because I just, it's probably not a good idea to use the body element as our parent element. You definitely can use it, but you don't want to, just because if you add anything else more to your web page, you'll see that it's going to screw up a lot of things. So we'll just make this the Flexbox, this section. So I use hashtag for an ID selector, and I'm just going to make the height as 100 VH and width as 100 VH. And I'll probably make the background color as some. Okay, so I'll just use a color picker and choose the background color as some shade of black. And so, oh, okay. So the reason this isn't working is because this should be VW. Remember that VH is for the viewport height and VW is the viewport width. And the reason there would be these white sort of margins is just because there are some default margins. I'm not sure if we mentioned this last week, but another selector you can use is star, which selects all elements. And I like to just set the margin and padding to 0. Okay, so now we don't have any margin or padding. And if we look at it here, we see the same thing. So the next problem is that we want to get the text on the right side of the, this is web dev. So we want to get all these social links on the right side in the same row. So if we put display flex around the parent element, that itself should do the job. Because by default, we know that when you put display flex by default, the flex direction is a row. So we have it in a row. One thing you may notice is that it's extremely ugly to have all the periods or the list item like styles. So I'm gonna take them out. I believe that would be okay. And then just as a refresher, if you put a space between two elements in your when you're selecting them, that means you're looking for the element inside of the previous element. So the cool feature about REPL is when you hover over a class name, it shows which element will be selected. So it's going to select some element with the class socials, and then it'll select whatever is inside of the unordered list inside of it, and only the list items inside of it. So it'll select these list items that meet all of these following conditions. And then from here, we can just say list style none. I believe that might be it. Yep, so we got rid of those like periods. To make this easier to read, I'll also make the color white. Okay, so yeah, that's a lot better. So we can see now we have this row where we have the social links are on the right side of the web dev, but we also want to center it. So what we'll end up doing is by default, in a Flexbox, we have justify content. We have justify content to the flex start as well as align items as flex start. So if we want to center it, all we need to do is set both of them to center. And oops. So we do that, and you can see it's centered in the middle of our screen, and it looks good in the full browser view as well. So however, this honestly, it doesn't look that great just because we have no spacing in between them. Maybe we can try out, remember that justify content is along the horizontal axis, so maybe we'll try out space around. This looks a little bit better. Why don't we just keep this for now? And if we want, we can come back and change it later. And yeah, so now we probably also want to change some of the font sizes. Just let's just go through and change the fonts. So if I have this, already have these like fonts planned out, so I'm just gonna write it out. But if you want, you can choose whichever fonts you really want. Yeah. Maybe we can make the font size Okay, and then we need to just make these headers larger. So we can do that really quickly. Okay, so now I think we've taken care of this. This looks a lot better. One thing you'll notice though is that here we were able to center the check us out within this box. So we'll use another Flexbox in order to center it. Okay, so we'll use another Flexbox in order to center it. If we think about it, both of these two need to be aligned to the center, and this itself is something we can use as a Flexbox. So why don't we make the dot text as a Flexbox? So when we make it a Flexbox, you'll notice that they do appear as a row, as you'd expect. So we'll change the flex direction to a column. Okay, and now we're in the same position as before, but now we can use align items in order to center it. And the reason we're using align items, although, again, remember that when we change the flex direction to a column, align items and justify content sort of switch roles. And now using align items will allow us to change position along the horizontal axis, while justify content will allow us to change position along the vertical axis. And here I'm just going to put some margin. Okay, so that may be a little too much. I'll just reduce this and okay, so we're looking pretty good so far. Maybe we might want to bring these two a little bit closer. So what we'll do is instead we'll change, remember that we use the intro box in order to create the flex box, which has the text as well as the socials. So what we'll do is instead of space around, why don't we just say center, and we can honestly just use margins in order to get some spacing between them. So we'll put here, we'll put a margin. So this is the shorthand for margin, where the first number will be both margin top and margin bottom, and the second number will be both margin left and margin right. So if we use this for text and socials, we'll get a spaced out box. We'll get the two boxes spaced out, and we still have them. Okay, so maybe 30 pixels is enough. We'll maybe do 50. And when we check here, yeah, this is pretty good spacing so far. And you can see we do now, now we do have pretty much the same Flexbox style as this. And why don't we go into animations. I guess we do have to almost wrap it up. We'll be wrapping it up soon, but I guess I can go into animations for anybody who's interested. So this library is pretty simple to use. You just need to copy this CSS style sheet and put it in your HTML code. Oh, for those of you that want to leave, I guess I'll show the sign-in link.
I sent it already.
Oh, okay, cool. Then it's just in the chat if you have to get somewhere. Okay, so you can just use this style sheet, and now it is super simple. When you can read through the documentation if you want, but they do say all you need to do is add this class, and then you need to add the class for the specific animation. So if I go here and I put the class name on this header, and now I select whichever animation I want. I think I want back in down. So all I do is copy it to the clipboard and I can use it just like that, and it should work. Yep, so it just adds this CSS animation to the element. You can do a lot more customization with this library. You can edit things like duration. They talk about duration here, as well as the repetition is somewhere here, I think. Again, duration, and you can do repetition as well. And additionally, you can also add your own animations if you want. Is there anybody still here? Yep, okay, so I'll just continue then. Yeah, so we can just add animations for this, but I do also want to show you the hover animation, which is something which you can kind of change CSS properties based on if the mouse is hovered over an element, and I'm just going to do that for, I'll do it for the list items. What we'll do is, why is this failed to connect? Okay, let's see. So all you'll need to do is use the hover selector, and we can change the color to, we'll change it to coral. Okay, so when I hover over these, it changes to coral. And oops, okay. So you see that it kind of changes very abruptly. Another thing you can do is you can add a transition timing, transition duration, and we'll put it as 500 milliseconds. And now I believe, yep, it fades from one color to another rather than abruptly changing. And you can do the same thing. And if you want, you can do things like you can change the position, which with a property called transform, and you just use translate, and we'll translate it by 10%. So you can see they move slightly up when you hover over them. And yeah, you can really change any of the CSS properties you want with the hover. Another thing I do want to show you is that you're not limited to using the hover at the very end. Another thing you can do is, if you want, you can actually use hover on the list. And what you can do is, so what this is going to do is anytime I hover over anywhere inside of this unordered list, it won't change the unordered list. Instead, it'll change the list items that are inside of the unordered list. So if I change the color to, or let's change something else. We'll text decoration underline. So here's what will happen. You'll see that anytime I'm inside of the box, all of them become underlined, but only one of them will be highlighted when I hover over the item itself. Anytime I'm inside of the unordered list, all of them can get highlighted. Yeah, so that's a pretty basic intro on Flexbox as well as animations. If there's no questions, thank you for coming out to the meeting.
I just want to show something cool that I did with CSS animations. So if you look at my camera, basically it's my profile picture, but like animated using pure CSS. So if you're like, if you spend a lot of time working with CSS, you can make really cool animations. So I'll link that in the chat if anyone wants to see it in their browser. Not advertisement at all. No. This is purely educational. Hey, thanks for coming in, everyone.
So you guys, good meeting. Went a little long though, didn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's all right. You guys have a good week. All right, take care.
Thanks for coming.
All right,
Thanks.
thank you.
You too.